My name is Lizzie Henderson. I'm the Director of the Youth and Schools Programme here at the Faraday Institute. And it's a privilege today to introduce Professor Bob White, who has been a colleague of mine and Emeritus Director of the Faraday Institute, along with many, many other qualifications and such, which I will read to you now to make sure I get them all officially correct. So Professor Bob White is the Emeritus Director of the Faraday Institute for Science and Religion. He was Professor of Geophysics in the Department for Earth Sciences in Cambridge since 1989. He was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society in 1994 and a Fellow of the American Geophysical Union in 2016. In 2018, he was awarded a Gold Medal of the Royal Astronomical Society, which is their highest award, in recognition of a lifetime's achievement in research. He's also a Fellow of the Geological Society, an elected member of the International Society for Science and Religion, and several other professional bodies. He serves on many of their committees. Since 1988, he's been a Fellow of St Edmund's College, Cambridge, prior to which he was a Student and Research Fellow at Emmanuel College, Cambridge. So he's been around here for a while. He leads a research group investigating the Earth's dynamic crust, in particular, the way in which enormous volumes of volcanic rock are produced when continents and oceans rift apart, and the movement of molten rock under active volcanoes. He's organised many overseas fieldwork projects and supervised over 55 PhD students at Cambridge, many of whom are now prominent in academia, industry, government, and education. His work at sea has taken him to the Atlantic, Indian, and Pacific Oceans, and his research group is currently investigating the internal structure of volcanoes in Iceland. His scientific work is published in over 350 papers and articles. And he told me just before this talk that he's just worked out he's been to Iceland over 50 times, and he's still one of the only people I know who actively runs towards volcanoes when he hears that they're erupting. It's a pretty special qualification, I think, and I'm really excited to hear what you're going to share with us today, Bob. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Lizzie, and thank you to Sarah for the title, which made me think quite a lot. So I'm going to share with you some of those thoughts. So my first thought was, how do secular people use terms like heaven and hell? And it turns out if you Google holidays in paradise, for example, you get all these lovely places you can go to: Tahiti, Cape Verdes, Paradise Cove, Hawaii. I thought it's a rhetorical question, the one on the top right, which was on the webpage. Why stay at the Paradise Beachcomber in Mauritius? Well, I can think of many nice reasons to do that. But the thing that struck me about all these, as these secular writers were reaching for religious symbols, in this case of heaven, paradise, was that these are all places where nature is unspoiled. You know, it's raw nature, it's beautiful. And if you're a Christian, then that's, well, a consequence of the Creator God. This is his creation. And incidentally, all these, and many others too, turn out to be on volcanic islands, which is not a surprise because volcanic islands are, as I'll show you in a minute, really fertile, biodiverse areas. I mean, you can get lots of others like Tahiti and the Azores and Tenerife and lots of places. So that's how secular writers have used paradise, heaven. But interestingly, when they're reporting from some desperate war scene with devastation all around them, again, they reach for religious symbols and they talk about it being like hell. I don't think they're consciously thinking of hell. They're just consciously thinking this is terrible. So here's some examples. Trapped in Hell was the title of this from Gaza. How October the 7th saw a kibbutz become a scene straight from hell. That's from ITV. Manchester Evening News, it was like hell. BBC, Gaza's hell on earth. But also you often find it of prisoners. In fact, I was listening to Radio 4 this morning and some footballer who'd been sent to prison for 19 months, but I kind of think it was 19 weeks because he'd assaulted somebody, and he said it was like hell. Well, I thought maybe it's not quite as much hell as these places. But they're consciously reaching for religious symbols. And I think the thing that is common to all these places is the inhumanity of man to man, the kind of absence of God, if you like, it would appear to be. Not at all like paradise. And in a way, that's exactly what the Bible talks about. Heaven is where God dwells with you. Hell is where you've turned your back on God. He's not there. So in a way, they're getting the gist of it right. Well, that's how secular people use these terms. Towards the end, I'll talk about how the Bible, how particular Christian Bible, because that's my religion, talk about heaven and hell. But first, this is an outline of the route I'm going to take us through. First of all, I'm going to talk about why volcanoes are good for us. They're a good thing. I want to talk about whether volcanoes are safe. It's not always a good idea to run towards them, as Lizzie suggested. Then I want to talk about why volcanoes might cause disasters, because there have been disasters in the last century that have killed 20,000 people from volcanic eruptions. Why is that? Is that inevitable? I'll just take a brief look at volcanic eruptions in the Bible. They're not talked about very much. Earthquakes, which is the other thing I work on, are talked about over 100 times in the Bible. But volcanoes are there too, and famines and floods. And then finally, I'll go back to the first question, talk about images of heaven and hell in the Bible. So before that, I've got a 2-minute video just to introduce what I do in Iceland, the sort of work I do. So I'll just shut up for 2 minutes. It's not very long.
Volcanic eruptions exhibit tremendous power. In 2010, over 100,000 flights were grounded when the Icelandic volcano Eyjafjallajökull exploded. It shot ash 35,000 feet into the air. But sometimes molten rock simply flows out of the ground like a river. That's what happened in this eruption from Bardarbunga volcano 4 years later in Iceland. Not a single flight was cancelled. The Bardarbunga eruption may not have been as explosive, but it was actually 10 times bigger than Eyjafjallajökull. It released the energy of a Hiroshima atomic bomb, not just once, but every 2 minutes, hour after hour, day after day, month after month, for half a year. At the University of Cambridge, we tracked the underground movement of the molten rock before it erupted, using the 30,000 tiny earthquakes that were produced as it forced its way through the Earth's crust. Students working out in Iceland found themselves in an exciting race using helicopters, snow scooters and four-wheel drives in one of the most rugged areas on Earth, trying to predict where an eruption might occur. The last few seismometers were deployed just hours before the molten rock erupted right in the midst of them, having travelled underground for 46 kilometres from the volcano. Then the race was on again to retrieve the closest seismometer and its valuable data, minutes before it was buried by the advancing lava flow. In volcanic systems, molten rock frequently intrudes its way through the Earth's crust. It is difficult to predict when or where it will erupt at the surface and what the impact might be. Our work at the University of Cambridge, studying earthquakes in volcanic systems, helps in understanding the processes leading up to these dramatic events.
Well, that's my day job, and you can see why I still keep doing it, even though I'm retired. I still regularly go to Iceland. We don't always get the seismometers back. The recent ones on Reykjanes Peninsula, we lost one. The lava flow flowed over it. But it transmitted right up until the last second, so it was a real soldier. Why are volcanoes good for us? I don't know if you can think of any reasons, but one of them is, as I said earlier, that volcanic rocks are the most biodiverse places on Earth. Hawaii, for example, entirely volcanic, is very biodiverse. And volcanoes bring up from the deep in the Earth all the nutrients, all the minerals that we need, both for our bodies as well as for growing things. So they're exceptionally good for that. Without it, this would be without volcanoes, it'd be a sterile Earth. Also, this is an example of that Eyjafjallajökull. You saw an example of it in 2010 that stopped 100,000 flights. The last eruption was May. I climbed up to the where it was erupting, had erupted just a few months later, and look at the flowers that had come through, really thick layers of ash that have been deposited from that eruption. So very fertile places. And that's one of the benefits. One of the other benefits, which may not be so obvious on first thought, is that actually they've saved the Earth from being a frozen desert. So the carbon dioxide that volcanoes bring up, and they bring up a lot, actually have a greenhouse warming effect on the Earth. And if it weren't for that, the temperature of the Earth would be about 33 Celsius lower. So it would be about, on average, minus 17 degrees Celsius. And there'll be no life as we know it. In fact, there are brief periods in Earth's history where it's pretty clear that the whole Earth was covered by ice. It's called snowball Earth because there's glaciers like this right on the equator. And the only thing that gets you out of it is volcanoes. Now, I'm not saying that global warming is a good thing, because what we're doing at the moment, people are doing, is we're putting carbon that's been accumulated over about 1 million years as oil and gas into the atmosphere every year. We're burning 1 million years worth every year of accumulation every year. And that's causing a spike in temperature, which it's really difficult for the biosphere and people to adapt to. So that's a different lecture. But the background is good, that would be frozen otherwise. And here's an example of a volcano under Vatnajökull ice cap in Iceland, biggest ice cap in the Northern Hemisphere. And it's burnt its way through, as you'd expect. And then it releases all these gases, and particularly carbon dioxide, into the atmosphere. So they saved us from a snowball Earth. They've given nutrients. That's 2 good reasons. Are volcanoes safe? The next question. Now, when I was thinking about this, I was reminded of The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe by C.S. Lewis. Do any of you know this? I expect a lot of us have read it. And when Susan first gets into Narnia, she's told that the king of Narnia is a lion. So Susan says, is he quite safe? I shall feel rather nervous about meeting a lion. Safe, said Mr. Beaver. Who said anything about safe? Of course he isn't safe, but he's good. He's the king, I tell you. And I guess you could say the same thing about volcanoes. They're good, but they're not safe. You have to treat them with respect. They are hazardous. They are hazards, and we have to learn to live with them. Now, one thing I want to say, which also helps them be safe, is that the majority of the Earth's volcanism is underwater in the deep oceans, where the plates are spreading apart, and you never see anything of that. Generally, we don't even know it's happening, I bet. And those volcanic products are just absorbed into the oceans. Now, they do lots of other good things in the oceans. There are thriving communities of very strange life forms at hydrothermal vents in the deep ocean, but it's not going to affect us directly initially. So the mid-ocean ridges are spreading apart, and you might know that Europe is moving away from North America at a rate of about 20 millimeters a year. So in your lifetime, you'll end up about 6 foot further away from America, with Europe is drifting away from America at the moment. So maybe not just politically, but geologically as well. So 20 cubic kilometers of the It's a bit hard to visualize, isn't it? It'll bury the whole of Cambridge, 500 meters deep, for example. For some reason, people love to talk about how many Olympic swimming pools it would fill. I don't know why, but just so as you know, it would fill an Olympic-sized swimming pool with molten rock every 4 seconds, every minute, every hour, every day, every year, year after year. That's how much is being produced, mostly underwater, 75% of it underwater every year. Are volcanoes safe? Well, they are pretty safe. We can predict them. We can work out when they're going to happen. So this is some of the work that Cambridge has been involved in recently, along with other people. On the Reykjanes Peninsula, it's in the southwest corner of Iceland. It's only 30 or 40 kilometers from the capital, Reykjavik, where the majority of people live. And Keflavik Airport, the main entrance, is only about 10 or 15 kilometers away. And what I'm showing you on the right is earthquakes, which happened over a period of less than 1 day, 3 o'clock on the afternoon of the 10th of November, 2023, until midday on the next day, Armistice Day, as it happens. There were hundreds and hundreds of earthquakes. This is a real-time recording. We've reanalyzed them later, and they fall on a much more precise straight line, if you like. And this was a fissure that opened, a crack that opened, and there were some very big earthquakes on this. They could feel them in Reykjavik, tens of kilometers away. You can see magnitudes greater than 5, which is quite big. And what you might not be able to see, although you can see it in the bottom of the left-hand corner figure, is that it went right through this town of Grindavik, which is the biggest town on the south coast, 3,000 people. More importantly, it's got the only harbour on the south coast. And because of this warning from earthquakes, late that night on the 10th of November, they issued an evacuation order from Grindavik and everybody escaped. Right? Middle of winter, I mean, not the easiest time to be moving, but everybody got out. And nobody was hurt in this eruption. Now, there's been 11 eruptions on this site in the last couple of years. Grindavik was destroyed by this, as some of the fracturing that was going through it at the time. And subsequently, they built big berms to stop the lava flowing, but the lava actually, the crack propagated through them at one point. And you might remember a year or two ago, some of the buildings caught fire in Grindavik. So it's very hazardous, but nobody was hurt. And in fact, Iceland is entirely volcanic island, all of it. There's an eruption at the moment there's been 11 in the last couple of years, but on average, there's a biggish eruption every year or two. And as far as I know, nobody's been killed by the eruptions. I mean, they live with this and they know what the signs are. Actually, I think a couple of German tourists were killed on Hekla in the 70s. They were climbing Hekla and it erupted with very short notice. But generally, volcanoes are safe if you heed the warnings. Now, you might say, well, that's modern, isn't it? We've got technology to record these things, so now we know. But let me just take you back in a minute to 1628. I just want to show you one other thing about volcanoes. Are they safe? Well, they're great tourist attractions, actually. This is that same eruptive system just outside Reykjavik. It was a great day trip, it's only 45 minutes drive. An enterprising farmer set up a car park and a hamburger stall, and charged you to park, then charged you to buy a hamburger, and you could walk up to it and watch. And I've done this. I've been within a few feet of it, and on a cold day in Iceland, in the middle of winter, it's rather nice. You can see they've all got coats on, but it's nice and warm at the front. So they are safe. You'll also notice the wind is blowing away from you. You really don't want to be downwind at these, because there's a lot of sulfur dioxide and carbon dioxide comes out, and sulfur dioxide, if you breathe it, turns into sulfuric acid in your lungs, which is not good for you. So keep up wind, that's my tip. But they are great tourist attractions too. Nobody's hurt there. But let me take you back to 1628 BC, when Santorini in the Mediterranean erupted. It blew out the hole you see in front of you there, the entire hole. Massive eruption caused a tsunami 30 foot or so high over on the eastern Mediterranean coast of Palestine, Lebanon, and so on, and also inundated the delta in Egypt. Putting salt water on a delta is not good. It might well have led to one of the famines there. It probably caused the disruption caused the end of the Minoan civilization, but nobody died on Santorini. And you might ask, why is that? In fact, there was a village called Akrotiri right on the crater rim, quite a thriving village, which got buried by ash. I mean, 20 or 30 foot deep. So it's been preserved. And all they found is the skeleton of one pig. So clearly the people had evacuated off this island before the actual eruption. There were warning signs. They'd moved quite a lot of their food, although some of it was left behind. One of the clues might be in this staircase you can see on the left-hand picture, which has collapsed. Some people think that may be due to an earthquake, but almost certainly there were big earthquakes before the actual eruption, and that gave people warning to move. There's some of the storage jars still there, some of the wall paintings. It's a beautiful place if you ever get the chance to go. So Akrotiri, no problem. They moved. And that generally is the case with volcanoes, because if you're going to move melt, which has formed very deep in the earth, probably in these cases at 30 or 40 kilometers down, up towards the surface, you have to force your way up. And you do that through cracks, and making a crack to make space for it is an earthquake. That's what an earthquake is. It's a small crack that's open. So you can detect those. If they're big ones, you feel them. And these big eruptions generally have big ones, big earthquakes before them. So yes, they're safe as long as you live in the knowledge of them. But as I said at the beginning, sometimes there are disasters when many people die. So why is that? Why does that happen? Well, I want to give you 3 examples, and we can consider why they turn from regular eruptions into disasters. And the first one I want to talk about happened on Ascension Day 1902 in Martinique, beautiful island, Saint-Pierre, where somewhere between 26 and 36,000 people died. We don't know exactly how many, but the whole population of Saint-Pierre died with this eruption, which was an eruption which causes burning gas to roll down the hillside, a pyroclastic flow it's called. There's a picture on the left there. And the characteristic of these is they're extremely hot. They're probably 800 degrees, ash, rolling down the mountainside. They're fluidized at the bottom, so they can travel at up to 100 miles an hour. They come very, very fast. And they're very hot, so it's not good to be in the way of them, but they also burn up all the oxygen because they're so hot. So you suffocate if you're in the way of it. It crosses you in about 2 minutes, but that's enough to kill you. So this is that thriving port of Saint-Pierre on the top left before the eruption from a contemporary photograph. And after it, you can see it's devastated. Not a single person left alive. Well, this is a map of this island, and the mountain where the eruption happened was Mont Pelée, and Saint-Pierre is got a red ring around it. So what happened was that this burning ash came down within that cone of red that I've outlined there. Saint-Pierre was just on the edge of it, but it was bounded, so it flowed down the river valleys. It's pretty simple, that's what they do. So why did so many people die? Well, there had been warning signs for months, actually, before this. There had been earthquakes. Quite a lot of cattle up nearer the volcano itself had died from asphyxiation. I think 1 or 2 people had died as well from the gases. But the governor wanted to keep people in town for a few more days because there were elections due. And the demographic of the people that would vote for him were the ones that would most easily leave because they're probably the richer people with more resources. And there's some indication now it was a French territory, that the French government in France also supported this. So what did the governor do with all these obvious signs, smoke coming out the volcano, animals dying and so on? He set up a commission. That's what people do, isn't it? Set up a committee to see whether we ought to do something about it. Well, there weren't any scientists in that area. The most scientifically literate was the local school teacher. So the school teacher and 4 other of his colleagues were on this commission. On the 5th of May, 1902, they published this report in the newspaper. There's nothing, the activity of Pelée, that's the volcanic mountain, that warrants a departure from Saint-Pierre. And he himself urged people to move into town, which actually turned out to be the worst thing you could do because it was in a river valley, so it flowed down that river valley. On the 8th of May, so 3 days later, there's this eyewitness report from somebody who was actually on a boat offshore in the bay, on which boat only 25 people out of 68 people survived because they happened to be on the seaward side of the boat, so they're slightly protected. On the 8th of May, the side of the volcano was ripped out and there was hurled straight towards us a solid wall of flame. After the explosion, not one living being was seen on land. So whose fault was this? Was it just nature or was it human intervention that caused it? The governor had actually posted soldiers on the paths that led out of Saint-Pierre. If I just go back to the map, there's a mountain chain just 10 kilometers to the east. And there was a well-known path down to the other towns on the island where people wanted to leave, obviously, go and stay with their relatives. He posted soldiers to prevent them leaving. Well, not one was left, but it turns out there was one survivor. It was this chap called Ludger Silbaris. He was a minor criminal. He'd caused some affray the night before and he'd been thrown into the local prison, which was an old Napoleonic store for dynamite. It's in the top left there. So very, very thick walls, very thick door, small window with just some bars on it. And he survived by plunging his head into the slop bucket of water and holding his breath. You can see his back is burned, but as I said, it rolls over you in a couple of minutes. He was somewhat insulated by the thick walls, even though up in the town you can see that bell has been melted by the heat. So he survived, but there was a slight problem, which was he was still locked in there. And it was actually several days before people wandering around the town heard his cries and let him out. And then the government very magnanimously gave him a pardon. They was afraid the night before, wasn't that kind? So that was one island, probably the worst volcanic disaster, entirely caused by human factors. Not the fault of the people that died generally, except the mayor himself, who did also die. So the next one I want to talk about is Lakagígar in Iceland, 1783. The biggest historic eruption in the world, it turns out, 15 cubic kilometers of molten rock poured out. And we know a lot about this because the local priest called Jon Stein Grimsson wrote an autobiography for his children, covering all of his life there, but there's a couple of chapters on the eruption. He's called it, as you can see, a very present help in trouble, and you can still get a hold of this and read it. And it was a very literate society, of course, so people did write a lot then. And he wrote about this eruption. It actually came from this crater row, which is about 30 miles inland from where he ministered, in a place called Kirkjubarkluster. Icelandic word's very easy. Kirk, you all know Kirk, it's church, right? Scotland. Bæjar, you probably don't know, that's a farm. Cloister is a cloister. So there was a nunnery and a farm, church, Kirkjubarkluster, that's where he ministered. And these lava flows were flowing around both sides of Kirkjubarkluster, which was on the coast. And they held a famous service called the Fire Mass, where they prayed about this. 50 farms had been overrun, but nobody had been killed by it because lava flows at a few kilometers an hour, maybe at most. So you can get out of the way. It's about walking pace. And they'd all come into town, but it was coming around both sides. And the legend is that straight after that service, the lava stopped and it turned and it went into the sea instead. So you can still go and see that church or the remnants of it there. Now, that particular eruption was recorded by Benjamin Franklin, who was US ambassador in Paris at the time in 1783. And he wrote a paper in the Literary and Philosophical Society of Manchester. So being Cambridge, you can just go and take it off the shelf. And this is his paper about conjectures about the weather, because it'd been a terrible summer. It was foggy and misty and cold over Europe. Well, a lot of our summers are like that, but maybe less so with global warming. And this is what he said. During several of the summer months of the year 1783, when the effect of the sun's rays to heat the earth in these northern regions should have been greatest, there existed a constant fog over all Europe, and a great part of North America too. This fog was of a permanent nature. Well, it was due to this eruption in Larkin. He recognized it had come from Iceland. And there have been samples of cores at all those dots all over Europe from that eruption. And we can see that the plume came down towards the southeast. Now, interestingly, in 2010, that volcanic plume from Eyjafjallajökull had exactly the same path. And samples, these are contemporary samples from 2010, it did the same thing. Some of the concentrations of gases were so high as to exceed safe limits during 2010, in fact, particularly in Ireland. And in fact, quite a lot of people died in northern Scotland in 1783 from respiratory problems. So people knew about this. This was published. But in Iceland, nobody died in the eruption. But the next winter, there was a terrible famine. So 3/4 of the horses, half the cows, 80% of the sheep died. And you can sort of know what's coming next. 25% of the humans died that winter. And it became known as a haze famine because of all the gases in the atmosphere. Well, we know now that probably the livestock were poisoned by fluoride coming out of the volcano. And nowadays, this is a contemporary one from the 2010 eruption. The farmers put the livestock into barns indoors for the duration and for a bit longer afterwards to prevent that. But the question is, why did this famine exist? Because Iceland was a vassal state of Denmark. Denmark was very rich. It used to send a boat once a year to trade. It would bring goods from Europe, and in return it would get dried fish and sheep pelts and sheep wool. That was the deal. And they knew full well that this was going on, and they didn't send a relief ship. The population of Iceland was pretty small at this time. It may have been 20,000, but probably less. And they could easily, one ship of food would have gotten through this winter quite safely. And they didn't. So whose fault is that? Is that the natural world? Or is it human intervention, human actions or inactions that caused it? I would say it's the latter. Okay, the third example I want to give is one that you might remember, a Colombian volcano called Nevada del Ruiz, 5,300 meters high. In 1985, on the 13th of November, 23,000 people died in mudflows, called lahars, from that eruption. Mudflows are formed because there's ice up there, you get the hot ash onto the ice, it melts it very quickly, you get a flash flood which picks up debris and ash on the way. So very dangerous, mudflows, because they're very dense, they sweep everything away, they carry boulders and so on. And they set. You can't get out of the mud. So why did people die in this one? Well, this again is an interesting story because in late 1984 and early part of 85, there was massively increased seismicity on that volcano. You could feel it. You know, the ground was shaking all around, so there wasn't any doubt about it. And the first eruption happened in 1985 in September. And so the scientists produced these hazard maps, and there's one of the hazard maps on the right there. In a moment, I'll show you where the mud flows actually went. That was published on the front page of a newspaper on October the 7th, 1985. But they only made 10 copies of this hazard map. And the local Congress, Colombian Congress, got a bit fed up about this because they were scaremen, ruining the economy. Well, what actually happened, you can see the lava flows in orange and red, the mud flows, I should say, in the bottom left corner there. And they followed pretty well the path that had been predicted, which was not surprising. They flowed down the valleys, flowed down 11 valleys, in fact, in all directions. I'm going to talk particularly about Armero, this town where 20,000 of those people died. Some died in other towns elsewhere. So this was in the path of a lahar, but it wasn't covered by it until about 2 hours after the eruption. These things travel at about 20 to 30 miles an hour. And this is what happened. Now, if you look carefully, this is the mud flow in the middle, the triangular bit, and the town of Armero went right across the picture, and you can see the vague outline of streets underneath the mud flows in the middle if you look hard. It destroyed most of the town, and more than 3/4 of the people died there. The first eruption in the afternoon was at 1500. People were told to stay in their houses. Second eruption was 2109, and that's one that caused the mud flows. And at 2230, they hit this town and destroyed it. It became famous, actually, because there was a 13-year-old girl that got trapped in the mud and they couldn't get her out. You might, I don't know if you remember that, but I'm not going to show you a photo of her, but she survived for 60 hours before she died. She was trapped from the waist down. But many other people died, including the mayor. And it turns out that the mayor had been warning about this, as had scientists, but the mayor of Armero, was called Mayor Rodriguez, had been warning about this to authorities, and the local authorities got fed up with him and told him to shut up. So this report in the paper said that Rodriguez made such a pest of himself that the governor of Tolima, that was the area, eventually refused to hear any more from him on the subject, even though Armero was in the path of that risk map. And actually he died in the town while he was trying to get help on his amateur radio. And at the funeral in a nearby town, there was a banner that was waved which had this inscription on it: "The volcano didn't kill 22,000 people, the government killed them." Now, this is such a common story of disasters. I could give you the same story for earthquakes, the same story for floods, the same story for all sorts of these disasters. But this is the volcanic story. It didn't need to happen. A report a few years later by a seismologist called Barry Voigt said nobody should have died. And the reason they died was by cumulative human error, by misjudgment, indecision, and human bureaucratic short-sightedness. Now, I have to say that now this volcano is probably the most tightly monitored in the world, and USGS does a lot of that. US Geological Survey does a lot of that monitoring. So hopefully it won't happen again, because it always does give warnings. So here's a natural hazard which is turned into a disaster by human agency. And often it's greed or selfishness that causes that. Greed for political power in the first case, lack of action in the Danish case. Actually, there were financial reasons why the government didn't want to move people out of this area, a main coffee and tobacco growing area. So human agency to cause. Well, let's move on in this last section about, does the Bible talk about volcanic eruptions? It doesn't very much, as I said. It talks much more about earthquakes and famines and floods, but it does talk about some. And one of the things it uses them for is as an image of God's power in creation. So, for example, in Psalm 104, may the glory of the Lord endure forever. May the Lord rejoice in his works. He who looks at the earth and it trembles, it's an earthquake, who touches the mountains and they smoke. There's the volcano. And sometimes in the Bible, they're used as pictures of God's anger against sinfulness, his settled anger against sinful people. The mountains melt before him and the valleys split apart. There it is again. Like wax before the fire, like water rushing down a slope. All this is because of Jacob's transgression, because of the sins of the people of Israel, said Micah. So that's a couple of ways it's used. And you might remember in the Exodus, when the Israelites escaped from Egypt, they were said to have a pillar of cloud by day to guide them and a pillar of fire by night in front of the people to tell them which way to go. Well, there's a pillar of cloud on the left from Eyjafjallajökull 2010. And on the right is a photo I took of that Holorun 2014 eruption. And one of the interesting things, some people have said, well, this can't be right because it must have moved ahead of them. You know, volcanoes don't move, of course. But actually, if the volcano's high, as they often are, you can see the fire a long way away if it's fire fountaining at night, if it's no artificial light around. But also, one of the things, and I've seen this myself, is that the reflected light from the lava flows, which are glowing red hot, gets reflected off a low cloud base, or indeed off the plume coming off the volcano itself, as is happening in the right-hand picture here. So it looks like a column of fire. And you could see that for huge distances away on a clear night when it's dark. So, you know, it's quite possible there was a pillar of fire a long way away and they just kept going towards it. And there's some indication they did, because when Moses got the 10 Commandments, you might remember, there's various descriptions of the mountain with thunder and lightning and thick cloud over the mountain. Mount Sinai was covered with smoke because the Lord descended on it in fire. The smoke billowed up from it like smoke from a furnace, and the whole mountain trembled violently. Well, there you are again. These are earthquakes happening on volcanoes. It turns out you get a lot of lightning in the ash clouds because the little ash particles that are ejected from the volcano rub against each other and make static electricity. And that's what makes lightning. So these clouds often have flashes of lightning and thunder going through, very dramatic things. And something I hadn't realized from watching eruptions on TV is how noisy they are, actually. Those fire fountains are jet engines, literally. They're very noisy things. Well, it doesn't talk about noise here, except for thunder. But it seems that's a pretty good description of a volcano erupting, actually, in Exodus then. Okay, so let's come back to that original question I was asked to address, images of heaven and hell in the Bible. Now, I said at the beginning that secular writers often use religious images to try and get over their points. Well, I think the Bible writers were trying to use images from the world around us, which we know, which is all that we know, to try and explain something which is almost unknowable. Now, this transcendent heaven, this hell, which we haven't experienced, but they're using picture imagery to try and describe what it's like. And so I think we have to remember, these are probably not literal descriptions. They're trying to explain something about what these places are like. And I just want to read you this little poem. You may know this from Robert Frost, written in 1920, called Fire and Ice. His little poem says, "Some say the world will end in fire, some say in ice. From what I've tasted of desire, I hold with those who favour fire. But if it had to perish twice, I think I know enough of hate to say that for destruction, ice is also great and would suffice." So he's picked up those two images of fire and ice, which I think the Bible writers actually, as I'll show you in a minute, also pick up. Interestingly, there's 9 lines to this little poem. There were 9 circles of hell from Dante's Inferno, one of which is volcanoes somewhere down at the bottom there. But let's see what the Bible says. In Revelation, where of course it's talking about the end times, the apocalypse it's sometimes called, "The cowardly, the unbelieving, the vile, the murderers, the sexually immoral, those who practice magic arts, the idolaters and all liars, they will be consigned to the fiery lake of burning sulphur." So this is one image of hell. This is an image of a place where God is absent, and those who've turned their back on God will end up. And of course, lakes of burning sulphur, volcanoes smell very strongly of sulphur. In fact, if you ever go to Iceland and have a shower, there's a good chance it'll smell of sulphur, the hot water, because they use groundwater to heat their houses and for their showers, not for their drinking water. So, and actually, when you've been there a day or two, you stop smelling sulphur, so it's okay. So this sounds like a volcano. It picked up a picture from a volcano. Certainly, the Israelites would have known about volcanoes. The northern part of Israel was very volcanically active at the time. But then you also get this other picture of it being dark and cold. They'll be thrown outside into the darkness where there'll be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Of course, those two pictures aren't consistent with each other, literally. But it gives you the idea, doesn't it? It's a really horrible place. You really don't want to go to this place. It's really horrible. And interestingly, there's no sort of sign of God here. It's weeping and gnashing of teeth. Well, that's hell. Let's talk about the new creation, another word for heaven. And again, in Revelation, this is what Revelation says towards the end of it. "Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth." That just means heaven and earth usually means everything in Bible terms. "There'll be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away." All these things that trouble us most, aren't they? Death and mourning and crying and pain. None of that will be there. "And he who was seated on the throne said, I'm making everything new." Now, this is an interesting little phrase. He doesn't say, "I'm making all new things." We're not going to be floating around as ethereal spirits on clouds playing harps. We're going to be embodied people where everything is renewed. And it talks about, in the Bible, about God coming down and Christ coming down to live with us. So it's as if he's remaking the earth without all the brokenness that we see around us today, all the pain and brokenness, and this beautiful creation that we see outside today in the sunshine, just spoiled by human sin. So that's the picture the earth is trying to pick up. And in that sense, those holidays in paradise were right. It's going to be even better. It's going to be even better than Eden was. In a way, it surpasses anything we can imagine. And interestingly as well, the nations will walk by its light. You don't need sun to give you light, because at the time the sun and the moon were sometimes worshipped as gods. Okay, so God is going to provide the light for here. We don't need those other gods. The kings of the earth will bring their splendor on into it. So there's something about the best of human creativity will be there. I mean, in the Christian context, God is a great creator, creative being, and humans sort of inherit some of that in a sense. We have that creativity. So it's great to see that the best of human creativity will be there. On no day will its gates ever be shut, because there'll be no night there. The night is where horrible things happen. The glory and honor of the nations were brought into it. There you are again, that all the best of this world will carry on. I suspect there'll be great music, great art. I mean, personally, I think there'll be great volcanic eruptions, and they won't hurt anybody at all. And I just want to make a little point about what Paul said, writing in 2 Corinthians. Paul knew about disasters, and he lists some of them He'd been shipwrecked. He'd spent a night and a day in the open sea and been in danger from rivers, in danger at sea, often known hunger and thirst, gone without food, been cold and naked. He survived an earthquake in Philippi, which is described in Acts 16. And of course, this is even without all the human things. He had to be lowered over a wall because the mob were trying to kill him and so on. He knew about disasters. And yet, look, this is what he wrote just after that. I consider that our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us. For the creation waits in eager expectation for the children of God to be revealed. We know that the whole creation has been groaning, as in the pains of childbirth, right up to the present day. Now, I think childbirth is pretty painful. Some people here will be able to confirm that. Just from observing my wife. But I also know that once that new child is born, often there's great joy. And they forget enough about the other pains that they go and have another child. And another sometimes. I'm not looking at Liz at all. But, so this is what the new creation is like. And this is how all the brokenness of this world caused by human sinfulness will be wiped away. And we'll be in the place and the people we're meant to be, that God meant us to be. And so I just want to finish now with some words of Jesus talking about heaven and hell, if you like. A tower fell down in this little town of Siloam, killed 18 people. And people came to him and said, whose fault is it that these people died? You know, they wanted to place blame always. It's what we always like to do, isn't it? Do you think they were, was it them that sinned? Was it their fathers that sinned? They asked them. Jesus' reply, as often it was answering the real question, not that question. Jesus said, do you think that they were worse offenders than all the others who lived in Jerusalem? No, I tell you, but unless you repent, you will all likewise perish. And repenting in this context means turning back into relationship with God. And if you refuse to do that, then you're going to go to hell. Though he didn't use that term, but Jesus did talk about hell more than he talked about heaven in the Bible. And interestingly, the same question was asked of him about some people that had been murdered. There was some present who told Jesus about the Galileans whose blood Pilate had mixed with their sacrifices. And he said exactly the same thing. This was human murder, if you like. Do you think that these Galileans were worse sinners than all the other Galileans because they suffered this way? I tell you, no. But unless you repent, you too will perish. And it seems to me that the whole message of those images of heaven and hell are to remind us of that we live in a broken world, which is at root a beautiful world and will be renewed in the fullness of time when Christ returns. And, you know, this is our opportunity to live in relationship with God or to turn our back on that when the alternative is horrible. So let me stop there. There's a bit of time for questions. Thanks.
Professor, I'd like you to talk about Krakatoa.
Krakatoa, yeah.
And you didn't mention it, but it was a disaster.
Krakatoa exploded in 1883, wasn't it? It caused, threw a lot of ash into the air, went all around the world, caused beautiful sunsets. Some people think that Turner's sunsets were governed by that because they'd seen such beautiful sunsets in Europe. I'm not sure how many people the eruption killed, but the tsunami probably killed people in some of the islands around about it. And I don't know the details of what happened beyond that, but I know that Anna Krakatoa, the son of Krakatoa, has also erupted more recently. And similarly, you know, it's well monitored and people know. But there are different types of volcanoes. Some give less warning than others, and Krakatoa is one of those that can be extremely explosive. The ones I work on are not so explosive in general. So yeah, I don't know the specifics of Krakatoa, actually. And people do die sometimes. There's no doubt about that. They are hazardous. We have to live in light of it. I think the Bible never says we're going to have a soft cushion life where nothing ever happens. We live in a world where we have to live in harmony with the world. But I'm always struck by something that was said in the Bible that, you can recognize the signs of nature, if you like, the signs of the world, and yet you can't recognize spiritual signs. Talking about you can recognize red sky at night, shepherd's delight, red sky morning, shepherd's morning. And so I think maybe not all of them, but most deaths are caused by not living in relationship with creation in the way we're meant to. So it's only a partial answer, but I don't know the details. Do you know how many people died in Krakatoa? Yeah, but I'm not sure many people lived on the island today. It's a volcanic island. It's not a very good place to. That particular one wasn't a good place to live.
Thank you for your talk. La Palma has also here the potential of killing millions because of a tsunami when the island starts sliding into the ocean. Is there a mechanism that we can predict accurately when to evacuate? Because I think when it happens, it's already too late. You can't evacuate all Florida, all New York.
Yeah. I was in La Palma last September, and that's another interesting case study because the scientists had warned that the volcano was getting very active. They'd watched the seismicity moving nearer and nearer the surface, and they have a traffic light system which is green, orange, red, and they wanted to raise the alert level and get some of the population to move out. And again, the mayor didn't want them to do that. He didn't want to upset things. And so they didn't issue a warning. And I've seen a video of a person on the local TV talking into the camera with the volcano behind us. So yeah, it's perfectly safe here. Nothing is much happening. There's what he points at a smoke behind the volcano. And so, in fact, nobody was killed in that eruption, but it flowed over, I forget, hundreds of houses. They evacuated very, very quickly. And so they had to leave stuff behind. So the issue of the tsunami, I think there's a lot of scaremongering about that because when a piece of island falls away, which it might, and cause a tsunami, if it's a point source, like a volcano, it's just one landslide, then the tsunami spreads out radially, geometrically. By the time it gets anywhere where other people are living, it's much smaller. And the problem with the Boxing Day tsunami was that it was a thrust fault which was 1,000 kilometers long, which just lifted up 7 meters or something. So it sent forward a wave all along that length, which then propagated forward and doesn't lose much height as it goes across the open ocean. But when it hits shallow water, then because the mass is moving, instead of a thick layer moving fast, it becomes a thin layer moving slowly, so the height goes much bigger, massive water, and that was why that was so devastating. So I think the risk from volcanic islands is over exaggerated a bit, although there is a risk. But there were some that came on Scotland some years ago from something called a Storegga slide off Norway, where a slide went down into one of the fjords there. And that actually caused quite a big tsunami in northeast Scotland. But I think it was pretty sparsely populated. I don't know anything about whether people died or even if it was inhabited. Actually, at the time, it was some time ago. Yeah, so you do get these. But when they're point sources, they're much less dangerous than things like the one in Indonesia.
We have a question online asking, it seems that when many people do die, it's usually the vulnerable, not those who are the offenders in terms of living out of harmony with nature, similar to the effects of climate change at the moment. Does this clash with our idea of a fair God?
Well, I absolutely agree with what they say. A fair God is, in what sense do you want him to be fair? He gives us all equal opportunities. The fact that the poor and the vulnerable die, that is always the case, whether it's from lack of food or from warfare or from some of these hazards which turn into disaster. I mean, it's a very good point, isn't it? And it's something that ought to make us, who are in the rich, high-income countries, take note. I mean, particularly with climate change, which they mentioned. We cause the problem. Well, then we ought to be helping to help people that are suffering from it to adapt to the problems we've caused and to mitigate our own production of future problems, which we're very loath to do, aren't we? Because we rather like our own lifestyle. So, yes, it is a continual problem, I agree. And I think the onus is on those of us who are from high-income countries to do something about it. I should also say that I think science is a great gift from God. The fact that we can understand the world and how it works and then put in place measures to prevent some of these hazards turning into catastrophes is a great gift from God. So we can build buildings that don't fall down in earthquakes quite easily. And places where they do fall down are usually places with a lot of corruption, where building codes have been ignored. I mean, that's well documented, actually. In fact, there's a famous graph of corruption versus damage from disasters, and it's just 1-to-1. The more corruption, the more damage. But yeah, is he a fair God? Well, he's a just God, and this is a harder thing to say, but I think I might say it anyway. People might push back against it, but I think sometimes we think length of life is the most important thing in the world, whereas quality of life and relationship with God is the most important thing according to the Bible, according to what Jesus said. And so if you die young in the new creation, you'll still be the person God intended you to be. It's all its fullness. That's a slightly difficult thing to say, I suppose, but I'm sure God is just in these matters as well as loving and so. But it ought to bring us to action, that fact, rather than blaming God, we ought to blame ourselves. So
first, I think it was wonderfully appropriate to have this talk with that picture on the wall that commemorates the motto from Moses's experience of a volcanic area and seeing it as an experience of God, the burning bush, which is not consumed, and finding God in that. And certainly finding not hell in that place, but finding heaven. And I hope you like that one. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, we will finish our time there. Let's say thank you so much once more to Bob for a wonderful talk.